Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Is this on? All right. Well, thank you so much for coming. I've heard that the 14th Street Bridge is closed. I think it's safe to say that the rain, so to speak, may be dampening some of our attendance. We were sold out. So for those of you who have braved the traffic and the weather, thank you so much. And I can promise we're going to have a really good discussion today. I'm Trevor Noblick. I'm Digital Director with the Online News Association. For those of you who don't know ONA, we're a membership organization for digital journalists. We're the largest, we're the fastest growing. We do a lot of work in the ethics field. A lot of our members have worked on various ethics initiatives. We have more that are coming throughout the next year or so. In September, we launched a Build Your Own Ethics Code. It's a website, it's a tool that will help you design an ethics code that suits your organization. And the idea behind it is that we keep the ethics that we have, all of the things that make journalism, but on top of that, we are layering on additional questions, many of the questions that we're raising today, about how digital changes that. And we have a recognition that so many different newsrooms have so many different needs when it comes to that a one-size-fits-all approach didn't seem like it fit. So you can go to the website. It's ethics.journalists.org. You can check it out yourself, and you can look to see if there are issues that maybe your newsroom does not address. If you don't have an ethics code, this is a great time to make an ethics code. If you're attached to an academic institution, we have a lot of people who are using it as a teaching tool. So there are a variety of ways that you can use it. It's brand new. We just launched it. We're definitely looking for feedback. So as you're interacting with it, if there are things we're missing or sections we should add or something's not working right, please do let us know. We're really excited to improve this tool and make it useful for everyone. And Tom Kent, who's here on the panel, is helping to head that initiative. So please do check it out. It's really cool. If you like the conversation today, we have a group here in DC, an ONA local group. They do regular meetups all the time. Their events are really, really cool. It's everything from visiting other newsrooms to learning about tools to just meeting up and doing some networking. It's on meetup.com. If you do a quick search for ONA, you can find a list of their events there. It's a really well-organized, large group, very exciting. If you're not from DC, we have probably an ONA local group in the area you may have been traveling from. And if not, you can start one up. And please do feel free to reach out to us. We have lots of resources to help you. We will have more resources coming online thanks to some generous support from the Knight Foundation to expand some of our local initiatives. So a lot of really exciting stuff going on. We also have an annual conference. It will be this year, actually next year in September in 2016 in Denver. So please feel free to keep an eye out for that. There's a website already, ona16.journalists.org. It has the dates. Registration should open up pretty early next year. With that said, I just want to say a quick word of thanks to our hosts here at the museum. It's a beautiful space. We're really happy to have this. They've been absolutely wonderful in providing the space and also helping us with the live stream. So we're very, very grateful to that. And so without further ado, I'll turn things over to Gene Policinski from the Museum Institute, who's our moderator for today.
Thank you very much, Trevor. And again, let me echo the thanks and the great idea I think have of collaborating and partnering with Online News Association. The museum is about the 5 freedoms in the First Amendment principally, but we're obviously looking at those freedoms and very much the history of this country and the future, really, of democracy and discussion and free expression through the lens of the newest medium, through the digital world. So we're very pleased to have this program, and we hope to continue this as part of an ongoing series of programs, both with ONA and our own initiatives on looking at the digital world. We have a digital classroom and an educational effort that I would also call your attention to if you visit the Newseum or Newseum Institute websites. The Newseum Institute is the programs partner of the Newseum, the structure that we're in. And welcome to the Documentary Theater, and those of you watching online, we're in the Documentary Theater at the Newseum in Washington, D.C. Glad to have you with us. We're going to spend some time talking today about ethics and ethics codes. You know, there's an entirely philosophical, highbrow discussion about ethics and the nature of them. Which I can say we're not going to get into. We're not going to go lowbrow, but we're going to stay on something I used to jokingly call full contact ethics, and that's the ethics that are really useful in the pursuit of of a free and a fair press and journalism, and as the founders really envisioned the protection for a free press. And obviously, new media has created new issues, but I like to think old values, even though it's new technology, are still in play. I just wanted to mention something on the outset before I introduce our panel members, and that is that if there's time after this program, there is an opportunity to visit some of our newer exhibits. We happen to be right next door to the newest one, looking at how the FBI and other agencies operate in a time of terror, and then unfortunately that's very relevant today. So that exhibit is just around the corner. Joining me on the front here of the room is moving from my immediate left, Thomas Kent, standards editor of the Associated Press, responsible for standards of fairness and accuracy across the world's largest news gathering organization. I think that's still the moniker. As mentioned, he is leading ONA's initiative on Create Your Own Ethics Code. He's been particularly active in setting ethical standards for automated news writing, virtual reality journalism, two of the cutting edge developments in the field of journalism and transmittal of news and information. Tom has worked for the AP in Connecticut, Moscow, Tehran, Sydney, Brussels. He's the former international editor of AP. From Ohio, a Russian studies graduate of Yale, and who speaks Russian and French. And we get any of those questions, you can handle those in those particular languages. He advises the Columbia School of Journalism and its School of International Public Affairs. Madeline Baer is program manager of the international human rights organization Witness. Her work focuses on addressing the challenges of the sourcing and verification and really the context of eyewitness footage, particularly, really as it becomes a tool for advancing human rights, protecting the rights of individuals. She has worked as an I.F. Stone Fellow in Human Rights Watch at UC Berkeley Human Rights Center, as a fellow in Jamaica, where she produced a video report on the extrajudicial killings, which was presented to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Before that, she was a print, radio, and multimedia reporter with stories in a number of places, broadcast on PRI, and her documentary film was a first-generation high school graduate, aired on the public television program POV as part of its Latino Graduates series. And Mark Memmott, on the far left, but your far right, as I pointed out, has been NPR's Standards and Practices editor since April 2014. He described the job as part principal, part internal police, part priest, with a smattering of journalism professor thrown in, I think was his description. He joined NPR in 2009 as its with its news blog, The Two-Way.
That's it.
And before that, he was with a colleague of mine. We were at USA Today together separately, I guess, in different parts. He was there for nearly 25 years. Reporter, blogger, columnist, editor, not all at once, though, I have to say. And I started as a reporter, have worked in print, television, radio, and online, and lecture on ethics to our diversity groups here at the museum and at our First Amendment Center in Nashville at Vanderbilt University. Not a topic that I'm hopefully totally ignorant of, but we have three of the best here to talk about that. And I wanted to open with a question to each of them, to have each of them respond to, and that is that a very basic question. We asked about 8 or 10 years ago questions of newsrooms about their ethics code. We got print and broadcast, online not yet answering, or even questioned, I'm afraid. We had about 500 responses, and about half of those said they had no ethics code, published at least. And that was an interesting response. So I'm just curious today, we're here to talk about the nature of it, developing one. I think that's a good idea, and I think generally the industry sees it as a good idea, but why have an ethics code?
Well, I think that the idea of having an ethics code is essential to the definition of what a journalist is. A decade or two ago, it was obvious a journalist was a person who was hired by a journalism organization.
Yeah.
But now a journalist can be anyone. So the question is, what distinguishes a journalist from a person who occasionally posts an opinion or a fact on Twitter, for example, or who publishes something, out of their basement on paper, and who's a journalist and who isn't? And increasingly, it seems to me that the difference is in the ethics. That if you have a transparent ethical code, if your ethics satisfy a certain number of things that are really basic, like tell the truth, correct your errors, and a few other things that we consider absolute fundamentals, then you can consider yourself a journalist if you devote substantial time to it and get some kind of an audience. But without that, without the ethics code, without a statement of what your journalism is about and what you stand for, then you're just another person posting stuff.
Mendel, you're coming at it from a group looking at enterprises that convey the news, but from your perspective, how important it is to you to see an organization out there that you might be dealing with having an ethics code?
Well, I'm sorry.
Both
No,
Tom and
please,
Madeline.
please. I'd much rather that Madeline. You're just staring at me, but I'd rather hear Madeline.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I think from journalism organizations, from news outlets to human rights organizations, as organizations that have a role to play in civil society, we live by a set of values. And those values for human rights organizations differ a bit from those of news organizations. But for both, I think having a code of ethics or having a guide of ethics helps us put those values into place on a day-to-day basis. And the reason Witness just recently released a new set of ethics, an ethical guide to using eyewitness footage in human rights is because we saw that we ourselves and our peers in human rights were having trouble figuring out exactly how to implement our values because the methodology of our work is changing.
Rick, I'm trying to remember in '82 when USA Today launched, increasingly difficult for me. I don't think there was a written ethics code. I think we had a couple of guidelines. One was diversity. The founder, Al Neuharth, had said that in one of the corners and the spots on the front page, there had to be a woman, there had to be a person of color. He was on that diversity aspect, and I guess that would go into an ethics code. But then it was no unnamed sources in those days. But I don't know that there was a written code beyond that.
I don't remember a written code either, but there was very much a sense of we were the nation's newspaper and we were there to be very objective and factual and down the middle. I mean, USA Today still doesn't even endorse a presidential candidate, I believe. They just don't take those. And the editorial page always has a, on the one hand, on the other hand, kind of balanced opinion. But I would echo what
NPR, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I would echo what Tom and Madeline said, and also add that there's some very practical reasons to have an ethics code. One is no matter what size your newsroom is, from very small to several hundred like NPR, you got to try to keep everybody going in the same direction. So you need that sort of set of, not necessarily rigid rules, but guidelines so that everybody knows here's what we stand for and here's where we're going. And for us in particular, since public is in our name, National Public Radio, and we do ask people several times a year, by the way, to give us money, it just seems like it's the right thing to do too, to be very, as Tom said, transparent and here's who we are, here's how we work, judge us by this.
Since we really do want this to be as much as we can, and given the shape of the room and what have you, a conversation, I'm just curious, those of you who represent either just yourselves as a blogger or an organization, written ethics code? Anybody? One? Two? Yeah, okay, that sort of gives us an idea of where we are. Is that surprising in a new industry to find that, do you think? And what's the starting point with ONA's
Well, we
project?
do have a number of people who have come to us, to AP, and said, how do we do an ethics code? And they made the very good point that ethics for a starving freelancer might be different than ethics for a big news organization. And the ONA Ethics Code project is designed to encompass all of that. We list in one place what we feel are fundamental principles that everybody who considers himself a journalist has to endorse. But then many other areas where there can be differences of opinion and where honest people can disagree.
Those of you, the two, who had a code, long, elaborate code or a statement of principles, or what's the nature of it? And I don't know if anyone would care to step to the mic, but yeah, please. Just again, we want to make this as conversational as we can.
So my name is Matthew Bay. Are we on here?
Want to walk over and see? Since this is a workshop, we can, or you can, yeah. There we go. Yeah, it's coming on, so go ahead and just start talking. We'll catch up.
There we go. My name is Matthew Bays. I'm the Director of Digital Strategy at Voice of America. Before joining there, I was with the Baltimore Sun, so I came out of sort of traditional newspaper, private sector journalism. We're a little bit of a different animal because we have 47 languages that we operate in, and we have people from dozens of countries around the world. So to try to kind of corral it into one single set of guidance was a little bit challenging. So it is broad. It's not sort of a voluminous, here's what you do in every single case, but it's meant as broad guidelines. And then occasionally we have discussions about, okay, well, how does it apply in this particular situation? So we had one of our services that had some comments that were coming in after the Paris bombings, not in English, and the question was about what do you leave versus what do you take down, what happens on our platform versus other people's platforms. So they're broad guidelines.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, could I ask a question about that? Do you allow some difference in approaches and ethical approaches even from language to language depending upon the culture and the expectations of the people in the target area?
Yeah, we do. And there are things I think that American audiences, there are some issues that I think we've settled on as a culture and that we say we're all pretty much on board with this specific issue, and that's not necessarily the case in other cultures, so we have to be sensitive to that.
Yeah.
One of the things that struck me when I first joined a few years ago, though, was these sort of abstracted ethical discussions that we have about how you have to, you really have to give fair coverage to both sides. And the first sort of culture shock I had was having that conversation with someone who had been beaten and imprisoned for years by their own government and had fled the country. And it's difficult sometimes to sort of sit there and lecture them about the value of objectivity when they say, well, they killed some of my family and they broke my legs and wouldn't let me see a doctor. And so we do have, there is some latitude for the different services depending on what their language is and what their cultural sensitivities are. But the broad rules are still, they would look familiar to all of you. They would look very similar to what you would see in an American news organization.
Fair enough. We did have a chance to chat a couple of times before we got together today and came up with some general areas we thought would be valuable in an ethics code or guide or compass. And there's one that touches a little bit on the fairness question, but it also speaks to, I think, what the great demand in the 21st century in journalism is going to be with all the potential voices. Is which ones can you trust? Which one bring you credible information? So to what degree should you try to codify credibility in that, in terms of at least a statement? How does one go about doing that?
Well, for my part, I think that there are a couple different approaches to that. The traditional approach, which is our approach, is that we don't put out anything that we're not sure of. I mean, we've made mistakes in the course of history, but our principle is we don't put it out unless we're sure. And we've avoided many, many incorrect reports and sometimes have been late with something legitimate just because we weren't sure enough. But there is a world of journalism, and I would call it journalism, which uses crowdsourcing to determine what is true and what isn't. People like Andy Carvin, for example. And he will put out, I hear this, and do people in Cairo, are you hearing this? Are you anyone able to verify that? I think it's fine as long as you're really clear about this is what you're getting from Andy Carvin. You've got to be clear with your audience about what your approach is.
And since you brought up Andy, he pioneered that when he was with NPR and is now elsewhere, but he very much, when he sees something is moving or people are tweeting about something, he's always asking, can you confirm? How do you confirm? How do you know that? He's comparing the photos to what other organizations are putting out, for instance, to see if they're the same. He's looking for historical photos to make sure somebody hasn't tried to slip a photo of an old earthquake in when there's a new earthquake has just happened. Really pushing hard. And that's an issue of credibility too, which I think he's done a pretty good job.
Well, and that's what I think, from my perspective, both as a former journalist and someone working in the human rights field, that I think is so exciting and inspiring about being in the field of information and of information gathering and communication in this day and age, because our sources are so much vaster than they ever were. We don't have to go to official sources, or we don't have to have our own staff on the ground in a particular situation. They might not have access there, or we might not have the funding to get them there, but there are average citizens who are there and who are uploading material to the internet. And so you do have to use the same methodology that you use as a journalist to find that and to look at that information skeptically and say, okay, how can I corroborate this piece of information? And through that rigorous process, we have access and information to so many more places and from so many more sources. But we have to have those standards of doing such, because otherwise, that's how we see citizen journalism degraded every day as a methodology, is people don't use those rigorous standards, or people think that that's coming from anyone and everyone without really being vetted. But to really incorporate that as a tool in news gathering and in human rights gathering, you have to verify that what it is true and trustworthy.
Crowdsourcing, though, would seem to at times be at odds with that, because you essentially put out a premise, which some people may buy or not, but then you ask for support or degradation of that premise, I guess.
I think it depends on how it's done, because it's if you're talking to a crowd that is also there at the scene and can corroborate what it is in the footage, or that the accent that you're seeing in a particular video is indeed from that place. That's where the crowd can provide a lot of information.
Okay. That's going to take us to our sort of second large rock, which is get it right or get it first. But we're going to go to a question here or a comment.
Thank you very much. Joan Michelson, Green Connections. And by the way, our speaking of USA Today, our podcast, we're just chosen as one of the top 6 by USA Today. So especially for travel. So
there
if
we
you're
go.
going somewhere for Thanksgiving, you can take us with you. I'm going to push back on this rather assertively. The wisdom of crowds is not always right. I mean, if you ask certain numbers of people, you'll get them to say that President Obama is a Muslim. Okay, I understand factually if you're in a foreign land, but I think that, for one thing, the rules of on these issues regarding specific events that are taking place and there are facts on the ground, et cetera, can be different than some of the other issues, especially politically and policy-wise, et cetera. And when people say, well, if everybody's talking about it, then it must be true. I was trained at 60 Minutes. I was trained in traditional media, and so the hairs on my neck go up, and that's how a lot of crap gets circulated.
So if you were looking at from an ethics code or a guide, you might recommend that you not crowdsource, or that you crowdsource only in the most transparent sort of informational way? What's going on, as opposed to positing a theory about somebody?
Validate. I mean, we couldn't air anything without corroboration from multiple sources that were verifiable.
Exactly, and I was going to say that, at least at our shop, and I'm sure at many others, crowdsourcing is a tool. It's not an answer. Friday night there was a lot of crowdsourcing going on about what was happening in Paris, and if you brought journalistic tools to it, you avoided a lot of problems. For instance, there was a lot of tweeting, a lot of speculation about what had happened at or in the stadium. Well, all you had to do was look at the BBC and see that they were still live blogging the game. It was going on. The game wasn't stopped. There was nothing going on necessarily inside the stadium. We stayed off of that. There are a lot of other sort of examples like that, where if you bring journalistic common sense and diligence to it, you avoid those problems. But it is a tool, I think, crowdsourcing.
Tom, in terms of new media, the new opportunities for a two-way conversation, it's like some people in this room, and much of my career was spent in that one-way sort of thing. We took information out, we digested it, we validated it to our standards, whatever they were, good or bad, and we pushed it out. But today there's this tremendous two-way thing, which I think the the tool for 1A and much of the discussions I've seen around it about that new ability for a two-way conversation. Do you think that an ethics code should assume that the news organization has to be right? And I mean that not that they are allowed to be wrong, but that they have to be the voice of accuracy, or in the same way that traditional media once saw itself?
Well, as I say, I think that there is, I mean, I wouldn't advocate news media being wrong.
No.
But I would say that, you know, some news organizations do see their role as the pursuit of truth through crowdsourcing. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. That's where you bring those journalistic tools.
One of the other big rocks in the stream that we came up with was get it right or get it first, or get it fast. I was in a discussion with a reporters group, right after the violence in Baltimore. And a journalism professor from American University said, speed is no longer a journalism aspect, it is simply marketing. And I've been bothered by that and intrigued by that remark ever since, that this idea of once getting it fast, you know, sort of saying, cede that to the Twitter feed, and the role of a journalist now is something else. But get it right or get it fast. I mean, AP has always said, get it both ways.
Yes, but right when you have to make a choice.
Yeah, that's where I was going. So that's still the case, and
It's still the case, and sometimes everyone has something and we don't, and it's because of sourcing. Just to take a simple example, Charlie Sheen. The whole world had the day before that he was going to go on the Today Show and make this announcement. We had the same sources that other people had. You know, we could have gone with it. We just didn't think they were good enough, and that was our call. You could argue, and therefore we were late, that everybody else had it. But we've had enough cases where everyone else turned out to be wrong that we could wait.
Yeah. And again, posing that to the people in this room who are often, I think, by the very nature of your work, on that cutting edge, that initial disclosure. Does your audience expect you to, and again, not trying to be pejorative, but to always get it right, or is it more important to put it out for discussion with some, obviously you're not going to intentionally mislead, but the verification, the waiting a day on Charlie Sheen, would that be as important today in an ethics code or not? Or because of this ability for a self-correcting mechanism, if you will? I did hear, and I will have to say a competing worldwide news organization, where a reporter was arguing for their daily morning discussion, in which there's all sorts of speculation about what's going to happen at press conferences and in developments today, for that to be aired, saying people will see it as a discussion, they will see it for what it is, and you know, you're going to have this international news organization with all the credibility of traditional media or whatever, at that time anyway, self-perceived at least, behind it, with people going, well, I think they're going to say this today, or I think this is what's likely to happen, with no real independent even attempt to source it. I mean, again, you know, it's the challenge, I think, that faces all of us today in speed and in this ability to speak to the planet. That is it, and again, I'm not trying to say we should deliberately be wrong or news organizations don't care, but I just wonder whether that value is somehow, that set of values has changed a great deal. I don't know if that's what you're going to ask the question about, but.
Well, mildly
not,
related.
right?
Mildly
Okay.
related. Hi, I'm Jan Schaefer, the director of JLab. So I want to sort of ask how the ethics tent would embrace some phenomena that I think we see happening, which is the appearance of new taxonomies of journalism, especially in the digital first space. And I would cite, for example, activist journalism, knowledge-based journalism, soft advocacy journalism, where you have startups covering public schools but doing it from a lens that they care about good public schools. Very much a departure from the dispassionate objectivity, and she said journalism that I grew up with, and very much kind of repositioning journalists away from being just a commodity but a catalyst as well. So in that kind of landscape, where do ethics codes fit in?
Well, then I think you get back to the issue of transparency, and we would almost treat those as sources. I mean, if advocacy organizations can be credible places to get information from, but you have to be very clear with the audience who they are, where their funding's coming from, what their view is, do they represent a particular point?
But I'm not talking about an advocacy organization as a source. I'm talking about a news organization that itself starts out with a soft advocacy point of view.
Well, and I'm equating them, that basically treat them the same way as a source/advocacy organization and be transparent with your audience. That's what our ethics would require. Be transparent with them about who it is.
Jen, could you put names?
Yeah, so
those,
if you look at
NRA
the public
would be
school
hard to
notebook
advocate.
in Philadelphia that covers public schools, or the well-known Catalyst in Chicago that covers public schools, both marvelous investigative journalism sites, but they care about good public schools, and their news report will reflect that. Or if you look at some of the sites that are covering the built environment, sustainable cities, Urban Milwaukee, planphilly.org, again, they're the only ones really covering some planning and zoning board hearings.
Yeah.
It's bona fide journalism, but they care about sustainable cities, and that's a part of their ethos.
They're coming into it with a hint of advocacy and a hint of expertise.
Which is why I call it soft advocacy.
Exactly.
It's not partisan
exactly.
advocacy.
And I would just say that
Interesting parse.
our ethics code, and probably many others, would just require to be transparent if you're going to use that information and evaluate it as any editor would, whether it's credible, valuable information your audience should have.
And I throw out for a comment, is that any different than a newspaper that editorializes in favor of good schools and then sends a reporter off to cover it? And does an investigation on how much we spend on pencils? I mean, if you...
Fair point,
I mean,
right.
in that sense, is that soft advocacy role any different just because they don't sit next to somebody covering the environment and who sits next to somebody covering the cops? And,
Right.
You know, again, not just, looking at sometimes everything old is new again because they're not in a traditional building sitting next to people doing other subject matter. Are they in some ways different? And should we view them ethically, or their ethical standards be different?
Right. I think we're merging now what have been classic editorial campaigns into news reportage.
Well, I wanted to get to the next question, but let me just say for Madeline, that gets to kind of your area where there is the issue of the use of video.
Yeah.
And it's sort of, again, everybody wants to hold authority accountable for their actions, particularly when you have the power of life and death. But you come at it from a point of view and saying protect the victim as well, and other. I don't want to state your ethics.
But I could also speak to my experience working for human rights organizations that are themselves producing reports that are then sources for news outlets, or are just skipping over that channel and have a wide audience themselves for their information. I think what I really appreciate about the ONA's Build Your Own Ethics Code is that it doesn't presume that you presume that your outlet is objective. And I think the idea of objectivity is being chipped away at, as we are seeing more sources that are bringing more perspectives that are not covered by objective news outlets. And so I think as long as any outlet is transparent about what it cares about, what its interest is, if it is advocating for a particular position, I think I'd agree that it goes down to transparency.
Tom, your organization is known perhaps most prominently for being an objective news organization. Is that a fair assessment? Forgive me, but of the ONA code, that you aren't necessarily stressing objectivity?
The ONA code offers an option to be objective or to have a point of view which you're clear and transparent about. The thing about objectivity is that it's often sort of misunderstood these days and libeled by some people as suggesting that it is some kind of mindless rote writing down of, on the one hand, on the other hand, without taking a position on anything. We do a huge amount of investigative reporting, which makes clear that some things going on are bad things, and attempts to bring light, or in a series we're running now, to free slaves, and we actually did it in Southeast Asia with slavery in the fish industry. So we can be against slavery. That's okay, but we do feel that when it comes to many issues about which there are, different points of view that we want to convey them.
What I see as a trend that I personally find quite disturbing in terms of blurring these ethical boundaries is news outlets, usually television outlets, that we know a lot of local TV outlets sell their spots to commercial corporations to have a health spot about what this particular product is about. But we're also seeing that then coming from advocacy organizations that might have the funding to send someone to a particular place and do a report on a particular issue. And it might be a great report, but that news organization doesn't say that this footage was actually from this advocacy organization. That's where I think we have a problem.
Some themes are emerging here in terms of credibility and transparency being a part of that, so we're getting to that. Let's go to a question.
Hi, my name's Dave Price. We're talking about sources, so I guess I should establish my background. Reporter, retired now. Technology for the young people for my generation consisted of having every key on your Underwood manual typewriter, and
The
very
M
few
always
of us
fell off.
did. Very few of us did. We didn't have an ethics code in those days. If it had been, it'd probably been chiseled in stone and handed out as tablets. And the last thing that speaks so highly of my ability as a reporter is of the 3 newspapers that I reported for, 2 are no longer in existence, and 1 is facing another 70-person layoff as we sit here. So that makes me an expert, I suppose. Now, I really like the idea, especially today. I think ethics are more important than ever in journalism, okay? The reason being, as we pointed out today, just so much diversity. I think, and then I also blog now, so I'm seeing that side of it. And as a blogger, I don't think I have to be as objective now because I'm clearly identified as an opinion. So it's kind of interesting. I've seen it from both sides. Again, for the young people, just schooling them a little bit. Even back then, when we were doing this, there were really 3 unobjective parts which will never leave the newspaper business. First of all, if you submit your article to someone else writes the headline. And I spent days trying to convince someone, because nobody out there could understand, yes, I wrote the article, but I didn't write the headline. And in general, always be a reporter, don't be an editor. I was both, but everybody does it. That was there. Then you have the fact that more today than ever, people aren't able, and really it's all about your readers, if you think about it, or your viewers. They don't understand the difference between an editorial page and a front page. Commentary.
Or news page.
And right, it's all blurring together even more.
And intentionally at times, as
Yeah.
we were just saying.
And thirdly, I think, which will never go away, is it doesn't matter how objective you are as a reporter. If you write about, let's pick somebody, Donald Trump. I mean, he can make fun of himself enough, but say you say something critical, Donald Trump says it's not objective. And now today more people are doing that. So I think what I'm trying to say is I love the idea of this, and I think it's even more important because for organizations, they have to have that to fall back on, to say, look, Mr. Trump, go away. This is what we did. This is why it follows. So for all those reasons, I think it's extremely important what you're doing.
There's an aspect of this that just occurred to me, and again, the number of people who have an individual blog versus work for an organization. Individual blog, work for an organization, or both? Yeah, both. Is another distinction, difference that ethics codes probably have to take into account that didn't a short time ago is the sort of self-driven journalist, the person who can reach the planet all by themselves. There's not a institution to hold accountable. There's no brick and mortar place to go to complain.
That's right.
is that- yeah.
You have there are small organizations, news startups.
Startups, too,
That's
yeah.
somewhere sort of between a news organization and a blog. And then you have individual bloggers. And again, you judge these people. The question is, are they journalists? My question would be, do they make clear, where to write if you've got a comment? Will they carry comments? Will they correct errors? And so it's in their actions that you determine if they're journalists.
Are they making calls to check out the facts? Are they doing anything to verify what they're writing, or are they just opining about what's going on?
And do they need a statement of purpose? to say that, or is it just something we can infer?
I would say a statement of purpose, absolutely.
Let's go to the privacy versus transparency, I guess, for lack of a better term. And this is where we're going to benefit from Madeline, most of all in this discussion, I suspect. But great new tool. Didn't exist. This thing didn't exist. Somebody just did a lecture here the other day and talked about the arc from film to digital cameras to this. The opportunity now to record and show everything from private moments to public acts is unparalleled in history. And now there's a big push, because citizen videos have held police accountable, for body-worn cameras now, for the authorities in effect to carry that with them as they go through their day, and the extent to which that comes. Two ways, I guess, to look at it: from the person being taped or shown, and then what are the obligations on those who would get that information? And then we can talk about what about public bodies and public policy about the access. But what should we do with this new tool? Should we live in a world of total transparency?
Yeah, so what the work that we do at Witness, just to give you guys some
Thank you, yeah.
context, is Witness is a human rights organization. We work to empower citizens and activists around the world and in the US to use video to document human rights abuse and use that video effectively and safely. And so our work as human rights methodology and as journalism has changed with more and more citizen footage playing a role in gathering information. That's where our work has really started to overlap a bit more with, in terms of facing these same challenges as human rights workers. So we work in three different aspects. We work both empowering filmers so that if you're filming a human rights issue in your own community, you know how to do that safely. You can think through the worst case scenarios of who might see this footage. And you have asked for informed consent from the people that you're interviewing. If you are someone who could use that footage, a journalist or a human rights investigator, how could you find that footage and how can you use that safely and ethically? And then we also work with the tools and the channels, the technology platforms, the cell phone companies, platforms like YouTube, so that they understand how their platforms are facilitating or hindering that process. And so the way that our human rights principles that we've used to train filmers for many years to document abuse, I think this really comes into play now as we're thinking more and more about using eyewitness footage as a part of a news story. Because what is informed consent? Informed consent is making sure that the person who's telling their story to you understands where it will be shown, what this is for, who the audience is, and can think through if there are different risk factors associated with that. And when we use eyewitness footage in the news media, we're usually taking something out of that original context. Or if we're embedding an individual's tweet in an article on a newspaper, that's going to expose that tweet to thousands, maybe millions more people than would have originally seen it. And so that's when we want to think about, well, how does the risk assessment change? Yes, that tweet was public, but that person probably was not intending it for it to get out into a much broader audience and potentially to have been taken out of context. And so that's where I think really new ethical guidelines are needed to help us as journalists and as researchers to think through how we can incorporate this as a tool in our reporting, but to do it thinking of those different risk factors for the people who are both filmed on citizen footage or the people who are tweeting or are behind the cameras. And just for as one example that I'm sure many of you are familiar with a number of the videos that we've seen documenting police violence in just this past year and a half alone, a lot of the people who took that footage later regretted having their name associated with it because they have since then faced harassment and intimidation. And so how can we, as journalists or as activists who could use that footage to expose this abuse, how could we think through exposing that abuse but ensuring that we're not putting the filmer themselves at risk?
There's a fourth party that isn't here today, and to some degree is just has to react to some of the issues we'll talk about, and that's government, where they have legal decisions to be made about access and the manner of access and the extent of storage, the length of storage in terms of time. There's going to be another player here, but today we obviously we can't set their ethical standards, but they have to react to some, the victims' rights, the rights of news organizations, the transparency aspects of our society. Let's pursue that a little bit. NPR, well, not video, but audio.
It's video. We have video.
Forgive me, that's right, on online. Is this part of your ethics code to talk about some of the issues? The old idea was you identified yourself as a reporter. After that, I'm a reporter, everything's fair game. So I don't know if that has or hasn't. You're positing that it has changed because of the nature of video. But
it's very much part of our code and our constant conversations. The informed consent is really critical, especially when you're out interviewing people who are in vulnerable situations, or you're talking to them about chronic health conditions, or you're talking to them about drug abuse or criminal backgrounds. You really need to, and we talk to the reporters a lot about, make sure that these people understand it's not just going on tomorrow evening's All Things Considered. It's going to be...
But there'll be video.
There'll be video. There'll be photos. There might be, this is going to live on the web, in theory, forever. So you really need to walk them sort of through that and make sure they understand. And at times, especially when you're dealing with minors, you have to get written from their parents' consent.
In certain interview
if it's a
circumstances,
sensitive
right, yeah.
circumstance. So we talk about that a lot. And if you don't do all that, you run the risk of later that person may come back and say, I didn't know you were going to do all that. I want that story taken off your website.
And the answer?
And the answer is generally, no, we don't take things off our website. It's part of the historical record. But if we've blown it, if we haven't walked them through that whole process and made sure they understood, one of our other principles in our ethics handbook is respect. We owe them the respect to make sure they understand before they agree to do this interview what we're going to do with it. And if we didn't do all that, there's a chance, we might take down that information. We haven't done it yet, but there could be the possibility.
Let me complicate it. Turn to our virtual reality person. I'd say put on a new hat, but it's probably put on new glasses at least at this point. So I'm at the University of Missouri, and I'm standing next to a photographer who's being challenged by some activists and professors in the crowd. And from what I've seen, I'm going to have a sort of 360-degree view. So all those people on the periphery, all those people may be shouting, who may be voices I would have heard on the audio part of NPR, not the video, or that I would have as a reporter taken down and maybe tried to identify. They're kind of behind me and over here, and I have a new VR camera with a 360. How will I should I worry about consent at that point, or do I need a sign or a blinking light that says, how do I get really an informed consent from people who don't know.
Well, at the moment, virtual reality technology is so complicated that it would be pretty hard to set that scene up without an awful lot of setting up and
Yeah.
testing. But
But
it's
20
a fair,
minutes
it's a
from
fair
now,
question.
it'll all be
20 minutes from now, it'll
done
be
by a
fine.
phone. Yeah. So.
And I think the same thing would apply to crowd scenes now.
Yeah.
That when people come out in a public space and make statements, that should be.
Good start.
that
That's
should- that
Siri's
should-
reacting to it.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. But
You'll get your chance, but you have to go to the microphone. Sorry.
I think that people out in a public space, they should expect to be reported on.
Okay.
And also,
Which is an
the
old
si-
rule.
Yeah, and the situation, of course, you're describing is far from the kind of abused survivor that Madeline has to deal with.
Yeah, yeah. In some ways, I would see a difference, but in a crowd where there might be criminal charges filed against you, and then there's a you standing next to that third you. You know, I mean, again, I can draw the
Yeah,
circumstances.
but this is the problem with crowd photography
Yeah.
in general. I think we can.
And again, it's a question, I think, for anybody with their new technology. Sometimes that's not a question that would have come up under an old point-and-shoot camera, because you would have known what was in your field, and people could have seen, they knew, if I'm pointing at you, forgive me if I might, that you're in my zone of photography to some degree. Now, your attention might be diverted and not know, but it was
And
probably
we have
easier.
long
Yeah.
shot
Yeah,
crowd
right,
scenes.
long crowd shots.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
again, I think if you're looking at ethics codes, you're beginning to have to confront technology. Almost outraces one's ability to sort of anticipate it.
Thank you. I'd almost like to hear from our Voice of America gentleman on this, because it's really a language and a cultural issue. I mean, you can talk to your blue in the face about where it's going to go and what the exposure is going to be, but if they have a language issue or they're just sitting there going, okay, and you're in the middle of a scene and it's like there's dynamics and I mean, let's get realistic here. I mean, there's only the situations that her team is facing. I mean, and in general, we're out. I don't care if it's a climate rally on the mall or something less benign, frankly, more treacherous. You're in the middle of a situation and people see that you're recording something. You can say a certain amount, but you can't flip over backwards and take 2 hours to explain to them to make sure that they're clear. You're not in their head. And I'm sure you run into this enormously with language problems. I mean, with just plain old translation.
Well, in
Basic
ethical,
communication.
let's just say Muhammad cartoons, if you want to bring up ethical issues
Sure,
in terms
of
across
course,
the culture.
we don't expect our correspondents to stop in the middle of a firefight and ask the person who's there,
Yeah.
do I have your permission, what's your name, age, et cetera. There's a practicality. I was speaking more about the situations of the vulnerable drug addicts and other people who we might interview for feature stories. But no, not out in the field necessarily.
That raises a question of your ethics depending on your source, rather than having a standard that you apply. Some people would have said objectively to everybody. I mean, some people would call it situational. Maybe that's not a bad thing. I'm just curious in terms of, has it always been situational? Did you treat the mafia mobster differently than you did the little kid who just got hit by a car?
You treat Senator McCain differently when he comes in for an interview than
Okay.
you do the person who has never been on the radio before. Senator McCain's expected to understand when he comes into the studio that microphone's live and he's going on the air. The person who hasn't been with us before, we might sit them down, talk them through, okay, we're going to talk for probably 15 minutes, 5 minutes we'll get on the air, this is going to be edited, that kind of thing.
And in the day when you today you're dragging the VR technology along. I remember the time when you would be dragging television or radio technology or recording equipment along. I'm walking through a crowd with this. Mm-hmm. They'll never know whether I'm recording it or not. I can be standing at the periphery and it's in a public space, but they don't know I'm a reporter, but I'm recording. I can be taking images of a victim being helped to an ambulance. No one may know I'm there, as opposed to this, almost the technology identifying you by what you were doing, even a notebook, in the old days.
I want to pick up on a point you made, because I think it's a really good one, that if we are creating codes or guidelines, we want them to be practical. And in our work training activists to film human rights abuses, if people are in a conflict situation, they say exactly that to us. They say, well, we don't have time to be asking people around us for informed consent, and it's the last thing on people's mind. And so I think it's important to recognize that in a lot of these situations, we cannot make the perfect decision. There's always a tension. And in that case, these people are making the decision to risk speaking out and to take that risk because their priority is the value of speaking out and wanting their voice heard. And so they'll take that risk. And so sometimes we have to just use our professional judgment to make that call. But we can only do that if we're asking these questions and if we at least have that foundation of knowing, okay, these are the sacrifices that we're making. So if you do want to speak out, these are the risks that you're taking.
Let me ask a question on the practical aspect of this, and it comes to mind. The First Amendment, the thing I work with each day, doesn't apply on Native American reservations in America by treaty. They're independent. Now, some have adopted it as part of the tribal law. Other places don't. There was a murder in a reservation area, on the reservation in Minnesota, in a tribe where you never speak of death. You continue to talk about the person as if they were with us, because there is a religious belief that they've simply gone to another zone of consciousness or area, and that, in effect, they're still there. And reporters were incensed, calling us, saying, I have my First Amendment right to interview people, and I'm not being allowed on. The gate has literally fallen to let us in because we're going to be asking questions about dead people, and the tribe isn't allowing us to do it. A cultural difference. How much respect should a code have for those kinds of things when you say it's so different than my need to get information? There's been a murder. I mean, do I just walk away from the story? I'm just curious how far down the line does an ethics code walk you in terms of your source, and as a practical matter,
Well, the practical matter, what are you going to do? Barge in there and demand and force people to talk to you? That's not going to happen.
Yeah.
It's just going to, you're going to end up showing disrespect to the whole community, and you're not going to get your story. There's
Yeah.
probably 3 or 4 other ways to get at that story without doing that.
People got phone directories and started calling
Sure.
in. Now, knowing that this was a violation, not physical, but a violation of essentially the sort of religious standard that was present there. And I guess some people would say that's good reporting. Other people would say how insensitive. You're unethical. I'm just, there are those moments that the worst time to get into, by the way, ethics is when you need them. I mean, that's part of why I think we're all here, is to help think about these things in advance. But
One thing I should add, at least
please.
our ethics handbook, it's guidance. It's not
Yes.
rules and regulations. I think
and I think
maybe
the
the only
tool
rigid
expresses
rules.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Every situation's a little bit different.
The only rigid rule might be don't plagiarize, I think.
Yeah.
Even there, there's
Unfortunately,
some gray
people are
area.
trying to
Hands,
redefine
yeah.
that too.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I'm worried
Exactly.
about a show of hands or an objection there. It's out there in public space. Do the old rules apply? Is that a traditional media property right that doesn't have any ethical?
Right.
Sorry, I'm just throwing that out. When we look at constructing a code, and maybe we can turn to you first. What's the first step beyond going to O&A and logging into the tool? What should you do? Should you try to set out things from your own values? I mean, where do you start? Where do you recommend that start?
Well, I think the first decision is really whether you want to be an advocate with transparency and recognizing that there are other points of view, or whether you want to be as objective as possible. And you can make strong arguments for either approach. So there's that. And then the second decision, I think, is whether you want to be independent of what you're writing about or involved. Let's take, for example, an environmental movement, since we have a colleague here from the environmental blog world. If you could be a member of an environmental movement and still write objectively about it. Or you might say, I cannot write objectively about this if I'm a member. So even though I like the environment, I'm not going to join anything, and I'm always going to be a professional outsider because I think I have to be. So those decisions, objective versus point of view, involved or independent, are the first things to orient yourself to.
I recall, maybe it was a year now, the ethanol story, that AP did an investigation on ethanol, and the conclusion that I drew from reading the series, just as a reader, was that the ethanol push didn't turn out to be the bonanza that people thought it would, that it was harmful in terms of crops and land and da-da-da. And I remember the ethanol industry pushed back hard right away on that. Did AP feel an ethical obligation to cover those objections in a high-profile way?
It all depends. You know, we have people pushing back on our stories all the time.
Sure.
And it all depends if they can marshal something that questions the accuracy of our reporting. We do run corrections.
Mm-hmm.
And we even have something called a clarification, which is not quite a correction, but something we left unclear, something we think we should have said. So we do that. And of course, nobody these days has any lack of access to social networks to blast away at the AP or anyone else.
Right. That's an aspect, too, that didn't exist when the corrections ran on page 6 in tiny type, or clarifications. That now the megaphone is almost larger in some cases for the critic. Yeah.
Hi, Christine Scheller. I've been a freelancer for 15 years or so. Can you have both a point of view topically and be sort of a neutrality journalist otherwise? So, for example, you might see somebody who works for a newspaper who suddenly gets sick, and then they start writing about that particular illness or something like that. What does that do to ethics, credibility, et cetera?
Well, to me, the editors have to be careful and be sure that the person is bringing her story and bringing good information, not necessarily opining about care one way or the other, but reflecting her or his experience, like a biography almost. And biographies can be wonderful journalism that may have a bit of a point of view, but it doesn't. Just because you have a life doesn't mean you can't write about it. Has always been my opinion, or report about it on the radio. You can talk about it. You'd have to be clear that this was my experience. And there was a colleague of Gina Mines at USA Today who died of cancer probably 20 years ago or so, who reported about it all through the experience, and it was a wonderful series of stories because she brought that perspective to it, and people could really relate to it. And I think she was very sort of matter of fact. And the editors helped her through that, I'm sure, but it's possible.
Sort of the ultimate of transparency in a way.
Yeah.
You know, it is its own guarantor of credibility because you are suffering. Now, what's your obligation to have different points of view about treatments in that case and things? I guess it depends on the nature of your piece.
Right.
I had another question since I'm on the other side of the room. It was about privacy. So when I'm thinking about listening to that conversation, I was thinking about, I go back and forth to New Jersey on Amtrak, you know, and there are these reports occasionally of a journalist who's in the business class and they overhear politicians and they, you know, they're just perhaps not being wise.
2
and the
weeks
things,
ago,
yeah. But on the other hand, you know, these Planned Parenthood videos, which are obviously undercover, and I just wondered if you could comment on some of those kind of situations.
Take that one, Tom.
Well, I'd say that with regard to overhearing conversations, there's no expectation of privacy on the Metroliner if you're talking above a whisper. So I think it's reportable. I think you would want to go up to the person and say, excuse me, it sounds like you're a senator and what you're saying is this and that. Give them an opportunity to say, no, you know, I was, you know, reading a script. I'm going to be in a play about a senator who I'm playing. I'm not really a senator. I mean, give them a chance to explain. But I think you have your opportunities there. I mean, if the question with regard to Planned Parenthood is undercover filming or misrepresentation, then that's a a belief that every organization has about what they should do. In the AP, we don't do undercover reporting. We've almost never found a case where we felt that was necessary. The truth will out normally in some other way, but there are organizations who feel that this is a very effective means, and it's the kind of thing I think that honest journalists can disagree about.
In modern times, this really goes back to an investigation with the Chicago Sun-Times, I think it was, in a tavern, which they set up with the Better Government Association in Chicago. They set this tavern as if it were opening, and then had all the building inspectors and health inspectors come in, and they charted a pattern of bribery and all that. And they were disclosed this huge layer of corruption, which everybody, I suppose, in Chicago used to joke about, but they actually documented. And I remember there was a great debate over the ethics of that, because they never identified themselves as a news operator. In fact, went the other way. They pretended to be bartenders, and they put microphones at spots in the room. It was low tech or analog, I guess, in the world of today. But it was very interesting that in that case, a lot of people argued the ends did not justify the means, that they would never have done it. Other groups, they win a Pulitzer, or they were nominated, I think, for that. Well, in 60 Minutes is another, Dateline, and there have been a bunch of those.
And there have been some court cases
posers.
where journalists were found, were found guilty of trespass and fraud and all sorts of things.
Violating obligations to your employer and employment laws in Delaware, I think it was.
Of course, the other ethical issue with Planned Parenthood videos or others like that is, what do we as news organizations report, and how do we use that video or that information? And I know we and AP and others pushed hard to get the unedited version, to get it examined, to see what was done to it. Same thing with some of the James O'Keefe videos, what was done behind the scenes to that video, so we can get a better picture of what was actually said.
Let me give you a personal thing, and Madeline, this may come closer to your work than anything. I was in Nashville, Tennessee. I needed to pick up a car to drive to Knoxville. And I went to the airport and got a rental car, 6 in the morning. I pull out, it's foggy, and I don't see an interstate entrance. And so I quickly made a real sharp turn onto the ramp. And sure, blue lights. I go to pull over, there's not room, I go back out, I come back over. So I've just done this, in addition to making a quick turn. Roll the window down. First thing the officer said, had he been wearing a body cam? I've thought about this. His first question to me was, "Sir, have you been drinking?" Well, it's 6 in the morning. I've just gotten pulled over by a police car. By the way, when I jammed on the brakes to make the turn, all the stuff I had on the passenger side of the seat fell, and I was trying to deal with that. I'm sure I was looking very weird. And I thought later, even though I hadn't been and wasn't nothing more than a kind of a grunt and drive better next time, if I ran for public office and that video was held, the honest thing is that he was pulled over by a police officer on October or something, and then you hear the officer's voice, "Sir, have you been drinking?" And you get my face looking up, really wonky, and then it stops and it says, "Nothing happened in this case," ... All of it's true. All of it would be accurate. It's third party, in that case, the authorities, but what about the rest of the video? If it comes, that video is then taken by my opponent, Truth Squad, as they're now known, or whatever, and it surfaces in my operation, Opposition Research, thank you, to put a nice name, and that surfaces then in my newsroom, saying, "Look at this, look at what we've just found." Where do we go with that in an ethical world? It's accurate to the point.
Yeah, I think a few years ago, as that sort of footage was just emerging as a more regular part of our reporting toolkit, there was a lot of talk and focus, as there should have been, on verification. And how do we verify videos like that? How do we authenticate it? How do we make sure it's real, that it wasn't staged, that it was actually you at that place at that time? And I think it's time to move beyond that process of verification as if we've checked these
Yeah.
boxes, and yes, it's verified, and really think about what's the context behind it. Because and going back to just the different sorts of news outlets that exist, if I see a report on NPR and I see the same story on Fox News, or I see a story on The Onion, I know what perspective I'm getting, right? I know how to contextualize the stories that they're giving me because I know the perspective they're coming from. But when we see a piece of footage like that, we really need to give the audience the information that they need to process that and to analyze that and to know, is that the officer's version of the video? Was that your cell phone version of the video? What is the information that we don't know? And so using that video to tell a broader story. And so we're seeing a lot of these videos that are kind of just used to shock, but what the best journalism outlets do is really use them to find the underlying issue and to build more context and really find out what's happening here and find out what slice of this story does this one image represent.
From each of your perspectives, you come back to me and say, well, we're not going to plump this on the air. And I say, well, look, identify it as coming from their opponent. And you're going to give them a chance to respond, in full, maybe even as you air it. It's not like it's later, 2 hours later. You wait, you get a response from me. I go on camera and say, oh, you got to be kidding, this is nothing. Again, these are going to be issues that people are confronted with, maybe not in such an obvious case, but other kinds of video.
Well, I think Madeline is right to say we have to look a little bit beyond this traditional question of is it the real thing? I mean, this would have been the real thing.
Yeah.
But the question we have to ask is it newsworthy? What's the there?
Yeah.
And if we're not convinced that it shows any pattern or any fact or any drunkenness or anything,
Right, yeah.
then it's just a piece of video. And this is the question that a lot of reporters went through when the Ashley Madison database came out.
Right.
So, okay, so someone had an account, so someone paid a certain amount of money per month to look around on Ashley Madison. Is that illegal? Is that immoral? Is it just, lots of people look a lot of stuff on the internet. Most of it's free, so you don't have to get an account. But Ashley Madison's genius is that they made you pay for it. But does it necessarily prove adultery or anything? Is it newsworthy? No.
Tom said earlier on objectivity that we're not stenographers, and that applies here too. I mean, part of our job is to bring the context to these kind of videos, and that's a core principle that should be in everybody's handbook, I would think.
Reaction, yeah.
I have a question about how you feel about the low esteem in which journalism is held outside of the Beltway, at least in the experience that I'm having when I leave our Beltway.
Yeah.
And with all of this attention you're paying to integrity and ethics, there could be a mismatch between perception and what
Sure.
you're doing. How are you going to fix that?
I'm not sure it's in that high esteem inside the Beltway either, at least in some places. I don't know. I mean, I've been in this business now 30-some years, and I don't think it's changed really that much. I mean, people complained about what I wrote when I was a lowly reporter at the Saratogian in Saratoga Springs if they didn't like the way I captured the night before his planning board meeting. Now it's just there's a much bigger megaphone because it's the web is there, but I liken it to when I would go in town and see people who I'd written about that day who complained about it. Now it's just there's hundreds of people who might complain. They're just getting more of a voice, I think. I think we're okay. What do you think?
I think most surveys say that people, well, let me cite ours. Every year we ask in the State of the First Amendment, essentially a question about, do you think that journalists report the news without bias? We're up to 2/3 of the public now consistently saying that no, journalists don't report the news without bias. I've gone a little deeper and said that seems to bother people less. I call it the Fox effect and the Rachel Maddow MSNBC effect. As long as you say it, that what you're, are sort of known for your thing, people don't seem so bothered about it. So I wonder sometimes with that those respect things, it's sort of, well, they're not respected in the old way, but maybe there's just, fine, that's your point of view, I'll watch you if I want. I don't know. For startups, I think this has to be a really interesting question. Where do you place yourself in that spectrum of those organizations? Do you frankly go for eyeballs? I mean, I'd think about clickbait versus journalism. We did a program with a columnist from a Midwest newspaper who said that of her 4 or 5 columns a week, she was required basically to do 2 clickbait, just sensational kinds of columns. I'm getting heads nodding here. And what's, is there a percentage? It's part of your ethics code that you're going to do on just clickbait. Again, I just think about this in terms of starting up. You've got to get eyeballs, but at the same time, you don't have instant credibility. But at the same time, if you want to set a certain standard, I suppose, for longevity. I'm just curious. What will the tool tell me about that when I plug in things?
Well, it does talk about clickbait and the dangers thereof. You have to feel that the piece of journalism that you're doing has some value. I mean, it can be fascinating.
Oh, yeah,
It
sure.
can be shareable, as we like to say, but there's got to be something there of value.
And the headline should reflect that value.
Yeah.
Even though a headline is designed to get people to read the story. So the headlines have always been sort of clickbait, but I guess we sort of, it when you see it.
Sir.
Hey everybody, I'm Kevon Painter, and my question is just overall about the value of holding media organizations accountable. I know that's a huge piece of the code of ethics for SBJ. It's about looking at other media organizations and holding them accountable. An example being the CBS debate with the Democratic debate, not too long ago. I find it very difficult to find that online. To let's say I wasn't watching it live on a Saturday night, maybe I wanted to go out.
The majority of your fellow citizens, apparently, based on the ratings. Yeah.
But then the next day, I'm looking for it online and can't find it. And it seems like CBS is doing a great job of taking down YouTube users who are loading it up themselves. So that's just an example of, maybe holding them accountable. And I just wanted to hear your take on how to do that in an online context.
We've opened a 5-hour discussion about the debates, but it is a great question, but there's so much there, I think.
Well, I mean, we view it as one of our core values is we have to be accountable for both the good work we do and the mistakes that we make, and we have to be proud of our work. And I can't imagine us doing a piece of work like that and not making it readily accessible. I mean, that's part of being the core values of a journalistic organization. I don't know the particulars of what CBS is up to or not. I haven't checked that out.
AP participates but doesn't sponsor debates, right?
We sponsor debates in some cases. I mean, not the presidential debates,
yeah,
but on a state level, we're
levels,
involved in sponsoring debates. And we do appear in debates and talk shows asking questions. But we try to make those real questions and not expressions of personal opinion.
And just to turn it a little, holding news organizations accountable. As the issue of video showing people who've been abused as victims becomes much more commonplace, I guess. What's your view on getting the crowd or your organization challenging news organizations? There's a certain freedom of the press aspect to, they make a decision, they have a right to it, but are you going to challenge, and have you challenged, and are you challenging people?
So that's what our ethical guidelines are for, and I brought a few copies, so please see me when this is done. But it's really to provide guidance for news organizations, because I don't think it's easy for them either when there is a new terrorist video that is a newsworthy piece of footage, and they have to decide within their newsroom is this something that we show to our audience because this is newsworthy or because of what it documents? Or are we going to report it in another way because we don't want to be complicit in the objectives of this terrorism organization? Or can we contextualize this video in some way? So that's what we hope that these guidelines will do. And I think, I think news organizations are also feeling pushback from their staff and from their audience of having to see graphic footage and being overwhelmed by that if there is a conflict, and it seems like that's the way that they're reporting on conflict. So we need to think of how we could use those sorts of videos in a way that that doesn't turn people away, rather than if what we really want to do is inform people. And then, I was also just thinking of this in terms of holding news organizations accountable. We've talked about the challenges of verification and getting it right. And I just went back this morning to a news article that was one of probably dozens of news outlets that covered this fake footage that was purported to be documenting a scene in Syria. And it was actually taken by a film crew, and so I went back to one of the outlets that had covered it, and 9 months later, that article is still there as it was, no correction. I did see, after looking at it for a few minutes, I noticed that there was a link to a related article by a different author saying, Syria video has been debunked. But it wasn't front and center. And so I think we need to think about how we, as these stories are continuing to evolve, or if we are putting on our news outlet stories that have not quite been verified, how can we continue to inform our audience as to updates?
Well, I think we've seen that this development of a code, that it's very personal. I think it starts with that. I think that's, again, point of to some degree of the tool on the ONA site. But that it also, there are a great many things that will transfer from traditional media to new media when it comes to ethics. That's not the case sometimes in the tactics and techniques and tools, but again, I think, as an old mentor of mine, John Siegenthaler, once said, old values apply even to new technology. It's an interesting thought. I think this is an ongoing kind of discussion. We hope to engage you again in that. I don't know if Trevor, you would like to make a closing remark? What's next, I guess, for ONA? Yeah.
You wanted to give the URL again, I think.
Yeah. What's next for ONA? And
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thanks for everyone for coming. We really do appreciate it. I hope this was a really enlightening discussion. If you'd like to know more, please do get in touch with us. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Our website is at journalists.org, journalists.org, and the ethics code that came up a few times is ethics.journalists.org. And again, we are looking for feedback. So thank you so much for coming out.
Please join me in thanking our panel members as well.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, appreciate it.